It's nice for me to be here. I was born in Calgary, so it's nice to come back. And I'm a proud Calgarian. And it's nice to be here and see, indeed, some old friends. And I would particularly like to acknowledge Associate Minister for International and Intergovernmental Relations, Teresa Wu Pao, who's with us tonight. So thank you for joining us. And this is a special treat, the final lecture in our series. And indeed, this has been a really great collaboration. I think there's been benefits for everybody, and I'd like to thank myself, Jill and Anne and the teams who've put it together. Especially Christine Shaw done an incredible job at coordinating a lot of details in this nationwide thing. I'd just like to mention the names of the speakers in this series because it's really interesting, the list of people. Our first speaker was Dr. Vishaka Desai, who is the outgoing director of the Asia Society in New York, who really put culture at the center of their programs there and has created a really significant museum in New York. She was followed by Jane de Beauvois, who is the president of the Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, which is a really incredible resource in Hong Kong for contemporary Asian art. And they have a terrific website, by the way, the Asia Art Archive. Then we heard from Philip Tinari, who is the director of the Ullens Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, in the 798 complex, which is a really important nonprofit space in Beijing, and he spoke in Vancouver. And then we heard from Mami Kataoka, who is the chief curator of the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, and she is the curator of the Ai Weiwei retrospective, which is about to open this summer at the Art Gallery of Ontario. So just a fantastic group, and I'd like to express my thanks to all the speakers who've done really wonderful jobs at presenting their well-researched talks, which are all available online. So I recommend that you have a look. Tonight we close the series with our most senior authority, a really remarkable person, Zheng Shengtian, who is really one of the great figures in world art, but in particular a very key person in the history of Chinese contemporary art since the 1960s. And I know this is going to be a fascinating and really memorable talk from Zheng Shengtian. I'd just like to say a few words about Zheng Shengtian, or Sheng as I call him. He grew up in the city of Shanghai, coming of age in the early days of the communist era, and remembers what Shanghai was like at that time. He comes from an illustrious family. His father studied, went to university, got an MA in the United States in the 20s, and so Sheng was able to learn English quite early on. And his brothers have gone on to illustrious careers. One of his brothers became the director of the National Film Academy in the 1980s, and he was the teacher of many of these directors who we now know for the great films which emerged from China in the 80s. Zheng Shengtian himself became interested in art, and he went and attended the National Academy of Art in Hangzhou, which is really one of the great schools of modern art in the world. It was founded by Lin Fengmian in the 1930s and continues today as one of really the largest art schools in the world, more than 20,000 students, a huge school. He studied there, studied oil painting, eventually became a member of the faculty there and taught oil painting, a professor, and eventually the chair of the oil painting department. Then in the 1980s, as the doors of China began to open, he found himself in the position of being the international relations person for the visual arts for all China. And as the trickle turned to a flood of students, curators, senior curators, museum directors coming to China, they all came through his office, and he was the person who took them off and around the country. He also went to the United States. He taught art on campuses across the United States and developed quite an international network. He was one of the curators of the first exhibitions of contemporary Chinese art to take place in the United States. And eventually, in 1990, he moved to Vancouver, lucky us. And he brought his wife, Ai Kong, also a noted painter, and his daughter, and they've lived in Vancouver since, became Canadian citizens, great Canadians at that. So he went on to become a kind of ambassador for Chinese contemporary art worldwide. He curated a number of really significant exhibitions and hosted all kinds of different projects and publications and special events. In 2001, he was the curator of Chaigo Chang's piece for the Venice Biennale, which won the Golden Lion and launched that artist's career on the international stage. He was the curator of the exhibition Shanghai Modern at the Villa Stuck in Munich, and also Art and China's Revolution at the Asia Society in New York, which was the first major exhibition about the art of the Cultural Revolution, a very important period, which is only now possible to really to see. Both those shows had significant catalogues. In the late 90s, it was my great honor to work with Zheng Shengtian on a project called Jiangnan, Modern and Contemporary Art from South of the Yangtze River, which took place in 12 different art galleries in Vancouver. It was a huge success. And on the strength of that breakthrough series of shows, we co-founded Center A, the Vancouver International Centre for Contemporary Asian Art. And never stopping, Zheng Shengtian went on from that to found Yishu Art Journal, which is now just recently celebrated its 10th anniversary. This is the journal of record in the English-speaking world for contemporary Chinese art. It's a regular presence at the Basel Art Fair, at Basel Miami, and Basel Hong Kong. And just recently now, it's publishing in Chinese. This has been a hugely important instrument in developing critical art discourse around the world about Chinese contemporary art, but also within China. He's a frequent lecturer at Harvard, Princeton, UCLA, Berkeley, campuses all over the place. He's a very, very busy schedule. He's just come back 2 days ago from China. His 4-volume memoirs, 4 volumes of his life story, were just launched Monday night in Hangzhou. And I'm very pleased to share with you the latest news, which is that Zheng Shengtian will be given an honorary doctorate by the Emily Carr University of Art and Design in 2 weeks. So with that, would you please welcome Zheng Shengtian.
Good evening. Thank you, Hank, for such a nice introduction. And thank the Canadian Art Foundation and the Glenbow Museum to invite me tonight to Calgary. I didn't visit Calgary very often, but several times. I'm glad to come back. Hank just mentioned that my book in Chinese, not in English, were published by the China Academy of Fine Art Press last week. So I was in Hangzhou 2 days ago, had a book launch with students and friends and artists. I would like to read, if I may, to read a paragraph from a book, one of the book, by the title, Give My Life a Scan, to start this talk tonight. This is about the Cultural Revolution. The chapter called Crazy Years, or English Frenzied Years. Since the start of the Cultural Revolution, I had had my share of suffering and injustice. Hence, I was easily touched by Mao's seeming change of gesture during his inspection to Central and South China in the summer of 1967. When my academy organized teachers and students to produce works for an exhibition to extol the revolutionary line, I sketched a composition for a painting based on Chairman Mao's recent inspection tour. The title of the painting in English is "The World Goes On with Changes in the Field and the Oceans." It's a line from one of Mao Zedong's poems. For this painting, I did not adopt the usual realistic method, however. Instead, I depict Mao's body symbolically set against a cloudy sky. The sketch quickly was accepted, but when I was about to transfer it onto the canvas, I was told that Mao's head had to be painted by a young revolutionary Red Guard. The body had also to be drawn by a teacher with a stronger revolutionary awareness. As a bourgeois intellectual amenable to reform, that's what they call me, my duty was to paint in the background. In spite of all this, I made no complaint. On the one hand, it was a great blessing for me to be able to pick up a brush again, because since the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, we are not allowed to paint. While on the other, it was exactly in the bird's eye view of the vast expanse of land and sky and the layers of rolling clouds that this painting's romantic creativity lay. So this painting called Mao Inspects South and Central China. It was well received and become quite popular. It was published and distributed nationwide and also reproduced on public billboards in many cities. But later we were told that Mao's wife, Zheng Shengtian, didn't like this painting. And so this painting subsequently was removed from public eyes. It was only after the end of the Cultural Revolution and the disclosure of many related documents that I understand it was only natural that Zheng Shengtian would hate this painting, because at this time that Mao was undertaking his tour of inspection and the leveling criticism against the ultra-leftist behavior of Zheng Shengtian's group, who later were branded as the Gang of Four. So this was one of my stories during the Cultural Revolution. As an independent curator, my interest lies in exploring the cross-cultural quality of art's transition from modern to contemporary. Focusing particularly on Chinese art, I have been seeking to identify the different forces that have influenced and shaped contemporary Chinese art in the past century. And I believe the revolutionary art before and during the Cultural Revolution is one of its resources. Following the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, the Chinese government began to promote Soviet arts in art academies. A pedagogical system designed by Pavel Chischakov was introduced into China in 1952. The adoption of this teaching measure is considered by many to be an example of the Chinese Communist Party's lopsided diplomatic policy towards the Soviet Union, as reflected in the field of art. But in fact, this is an inaccurate view. Chischakhov's realistic painting approach is a continuation of the tradition of the European academism. Ironically, the classical European art training method was even strengthened during this period of communist China. From the 1950s to the early 60s, Chinese art students still spend most of their time in studio drawing plaster casts of classical Greek sculpture or nude models. Perhaps the best-known example was a Moscow-based artist, Konstantin Maximov, who was sent by the Soviet government to the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing in 1955. Here is the artist, to train Chinese artists in Soviet-style realism. His class was immensely popular and influenced an entire generation of Chinese artists. On the other side was the indoctrination in socialist ideology and the Communist Party policy. In 1951, the established policy guideline for artists in China was to implement all forms of arts and integrate them with the current social struggles and the works of art for the masses. This echoed Lenin's point of view that art must be part of a revolution and art should become the overture of the revolution and Communist Party. So most artworks produced from 1949 to 1969 in China followed this direction of socialist realism. They are often seen as a pure propaganda and not worthy of scholarly study or aesthetic scrutiny. Yeah, this is an example of a Chinese painting, how much it was influenced by Russian Soviet socialist realism. It is true that all artists were required to produce art that served the party's interest, and personal freedom was not encouraged. But the enormous number of artworks produced during this period, including the Cultural Revolution, shouldn't be overlooked. In 2002, I co-curated the art of the great proletarian cultural revolution for Balkan Gallery, University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and the power plant in Toronto. Actually, tonight I met Wayne, we just worked together for that show. From 2005 with Melissa Chu, I started another curatorial project examining the influence of revolutionary art on contemporary Chinese culture. The show expands the scope of contemporary Chinese culture and art by taking into consideration China's revolution and the foreign influences introduced mostly by the Soviet Union. I regard this show as a part of the installations in investigating the wide foundation of contemporary Chinese art. This is a very famous group of sculptures made in 1968, 69 by Sichuan Academy and the artists, the local artists in Sichuan. And we were able to bring a set of this sculpture to New York. They're called Rent Collection Courtyard. It's a very popular artwork during and before the Cultural Revolution. Art and China's Revolution opened in September 2009 at the Asia Society Museum in New York. The exhibition brought together large-scale oil paintings, ink paintings, sculptures, drawings, and artists' sketchbooks, woodblock prints, posters, and objects from everyday life, many never shown before. It is the first exhibition ever to examine in depth the powerful and the complicated effects of Mao Zedong's revolutionary ideals on artists and art production in China. The show brought the largest audience to the museum since its establishment in the 1950s. As my co-curator Melissa Chu acknowledged, quote, "For better or worse, then, the art of this time represents a significant cultural event in China, one that deserves attention not only for its own merits, but because it continues to influence Chinese art and the visual culture." As artist Xu Bing has said, if anyone wants to probe deeply into the underpinnings of contemporary Chinese art, one must consider the influence of the Cultural Revolution on my generation, because it was an entirely unique experience. That was quoted by Xu Bing from Xu Bing's talk interview. Xu Bing is now the vice president of Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. He used to live in New York. He's one of the most important contemporary Chinese art. He showed in MoMA, in Tate Modern, many important institutions. His opinion about cultural revolution influence, I think not from his own experience, but also represent a view of many his colleagues. When we opened this show in New York, this is Xu Bing, and his sketch made during the Cultural Revolution. We were able to also display sketches by Luo Zhongli, another very important contemporary Chinese artist now, who is the president of Sichuan Academy of Fine Arts. We invite Luo Zhongli and also invite this artist, Shen Jiawei, to New York for the opening. And they both were very impressed by the show, because Luo Zhongli told me, since he was a kid during the Cultural Revolution, he saw all these artworks from reproduction. They never had a chance to see original work. Even he was impressed by those work, was educated by those artworks, but he had never had a chance to see original work. After so many years, now he become an important artist. He was very excited to face this original work. He was familiar, since his childhood, and we were able to brought those painting from the collector, mostly private collectors, and some organizations outside of China. Unfortunately, in China, Cultural Revolution is still a taboo and not allowed to talk about or exhibit. We spent almost 2 years negotiating with the Chinese government, with one of the exhibition agency under the Culture Ministry. We almost get a permission to bring some works from Chinese official museums, but at the end, it was still stopped by the central government. the reason, the excuse was that China was going to have an Olympics, so they didn't want to have any bad image for China. But I thought that probably is just kind of an excuse, because the truth was the Cultural Revolution still is not a topic you can talk freely in China. So there's the lobby of the museum and the sign outside of the show. Late 1970s saw the growth of contemporary Chinese art in China when the so-called Cultural Revolution ended. Many believe this was triggered by the China's reform and the opening up policy that allowed the Western, modern, and the contemporary arts being introduced into China. So this is a very common opinion that Chinese contemporary only started from early 1980s, because before that, Chinese artists or students had no chance to get in touch with or had a chance to learn Western art. So one of the events in 1982 became like a keystone of this new development, which was the exhibition by Robert Rauschenberg in Beijing in 1985. Last month I gave a talk at TED Modern about pop art in China, and we discussed about this influence of Rauschenberg's exhibition in Beijing, and another visit earlier in 1982 by Andy Warhol. So those Western artists were allowed to go to China right after Cultural Revolution. Not only Andy Warhol and Rauschenberg, there are many others, like George Segal and like David Hockney, and some of the artists, their visits never recorded. Very hard to find any information about their trip, but we gradually we find the names, because the 1980s was the time China just slightly opened the door, and all these artists, especially they had kind of a curiosity of looking, what's going on in China. And they heard about the Cultural Revolution, but they never really had a chance to get the first-hand information. So they all rushed to China, and many just joined the tourist group. So nobody knew who they are. Even Andy Warhol, recently I interviewed a guy who invited Andy Warhol in 1982. He said that he brought Andy Warhol to Beijing, but there was no artist or anyone knew who Andy Warhol was. And Andy Warhol was always wear this wig, like a silver white wig. People just look at him like a strange foreigner. And he was kind of disappointed. Because in the West, he was so famous now in China, but he just a tourist on the street. And there was no fun, there was no party, no nightlife. So after 3 days, Warhol said, let's go home. So then, but it was very interesting because after many years, of course, pop art became a major influence on Chinese art. But my argument is that actually this dialogue between West and East is not just a start from 1980s. Actually, the cultural dialogue and the exchange between China and the West started more than a century ago, but it was interrupted for almost 3 decades under the communist regime. So mainly due to this interruption, the scholarly research on the discourse among artists in China and the West in the first half of the 20th century has been remarkably rare. The majority of materials on the subject were not published or discovered. In fact, the only art exhibition in the West since the 1930s which addressed this topic took place in Munich in 2004, as Hank just mentioned, at the Museum of Wilhelmsburg. Titled Shanghai Modern, the exhibition was co-curated by Joanne Bernie-Dansker, then director of the Museum of Wilhelmsburg in Munich, Professor Ken Lam, then at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and myself. It was a joint project between the city of Shanghai and the city of Munich, presenting dialogues between modernism and the Chinese culture in the 1930s and 1940s, and its impact on contemporary artist practice. We conducted very intense research in preparation for the exhibition project in both China and in Europe between 2001 and 2004. During our research, we come across many interesting materials in both areas which illuminate the relationship between East and West and the debates on this relationship amongst Chinese intellectuals and artists before the World War II. These debates provided a framework which has influenced art practice in China over the past 80 years and may still stimulate dialogue among us today. At the turn of the 20th century, individual Chinese students began to go overseas to study Western art. Before 1949, virtually all the principal teachers at Chinese art schools had studied abroad in Europe or Japan. The majority of group went to Japan because it was closer and cheaper. But about 20, 30 artists had the opportunity to study in Paris or some other European cities. As a consequence, the academic curriculum and methodology used at the time were structured after those of the art schools in Paris and Tokyo. So it's mostly a kind of a Western model which was set up by artists coming back from those countries. One of the key artists, curator, educator engaged in this exhibition was the Shanghai artist Liu Haishu, who in 1934 organized a major exhibition of modern Chinese painting at the Prussian Academy of Arts in Berlin, that later toured to Hamburg, Dusseldorf, Amsterdam, Geneva, and many other European cities. The exhibition showed 297 works representing 4 schools of modern ink paintings in the early 20th century. A German curator, William Kohn, described the exhibition hailed by the entire German press with almost unanimous approval. The State Museum of Berlin received a group of paintings as a gift from the show and established its first modern Chinese painting collection, including important works by artists like Huang Binghong, Gao Qifeng, and Pan Tianshou. Later, these paintings were seized and taken to Russia by Soviet troops in 1945. So we still find those works in St. Petersburg, not returned to Germany. But this guy, William Cohn, was very interesting. We find his story. He was the curator in National Museum in Berlin, but because he was a Jewish, so he was forced, before even this Chinese project finished, he was forced to leave Germany. And he found his new home in England, and he started actually the new Museum of Eastern Art at Oxford University. Now is the Museum of Ashmolean Museum. This very famous Asian art museum. So William Collin wrote a lot about how Chinese ink painting, what's the impact at that time on in Europe. So we started this show by willing to introduce the influence from Western modernism to China. But during the process of research, we find actually this is like two-sided dialogue. Not only the Western modernism was introduced to China during that time, but also Chinese ink painting, the modern ink painting, was introduced to the West. Actually, there was a very active, intense dialogue between Chinese art and the Western artists in 1930 and early 1940s. The exhibition Shanghai Modern introduced many undisclosed historical events like this, and showcase the artists who played significant roles in the cultural dialogue. Besides painting using Chinese and the Western media, it also displayed the sample of woodcuts, prints, photographers, films, architecture, graphic, and even fashion design. I consider this is another part of my ongoing project in exploring the major international interchanges that help shaping contemporary Chinese art. This is a painting show whose work was in the Berlin show, included. Okay, now I'm going to talk about another source of contemporary Chinese art, which are very little discussed by scholars. Even in recognizing modernist and the revolutionary influence, contemporary Chinese art still suffers from the stigma that it is a product mainly under the Western influence. Very few acknowledge the cultural dialogue occurring prior to the opening of China in 1980s, especially during the mid-20th centuries, when China was completely closed to the West. Owing to China's political inclinations from the early 1950s to the late 1970s, they choose to engage only with countries of the third world. Mexico was one such country invited into dialogue with China. The exchange produced undeniable influences largely overlooked by today's scholars. Documented contact between Mexico and China can be found as early as the 1930s, when the famous writer Lu Xun, introduced Diego Rivera's mural, The Night of the Poor, in a left-wing magazine, Big Dipper, for the first time in early 1930s. Mexican artist Miguel Covarrubias visited Shanghai a couple of times, and soon become the mentor of a group of young Chinese artists. His influence has been obvious in the development of the popular art form in China. After China's Communist Revolution, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to discuss all the stories about those artists. I find the information about Covarrubias, who visited China in 1930s from a book written by American writer who lived in Shanghai at that time. She was a reporter for New York Times, and she received Covarrubias. But then we find more information from Chinese artists. When they were young, living in Shanghai, working for magazines, publishing houses, and they met Covarrubias, and they learned a lot from him. Not only his own work, but many other informations about the Western art. So in their memoirs, they said, "This guy changed my life," or give me the most important lessons, something like that. And those young artists then, after 30 years, 40 years, they become very important artists in Chinese art scene. One of the artists we called the father of modern design. Another artist was the best brush painter, figurative brush painter in 20th century. All these artists, respect him very much. And when I introduced this story to my colleagues in Mexico City, they were very surprised because nobody heard about this exchange. And they were very proud now they learned that Chinese artists took a lot from their, the Mexican artists. So after China's communist revolution, cultural exchange continues to develop between the two struggle developing countries well into the 1950s. A major exhibition took place in July 1956. Ignacio Aguirre, the secretary of the Mexican National Plastic Art Front, visited China and brought 138 paintings and 258 graphic works to Beijing. This is another story about Diego Rivera. He created this huge painting in 1952 during the Korean War. So you can see the subject is very political. One side is Mao Zedong and Stalin. And then on the other side, you will see the US and British as the enemy of confrontation of this two sides. So Diego Rivera was going to give this work to an exhibition for Europe. Then the government organized this Mexican art show in Europe. But when they find that the painting was has this subject, they reject the painting. They didn't dare to send to Paris. The rumor says it was first against the painting when they released the American ambassador in Mexico City criticized this painting. So Diego Rivera got very angry, and he said, "You don't want this painting, I give it to Mao Zedong." So he actually sent this work to China as a gift. This is a 10 meters long oil paint, the painting on canvas. Now in Mexico City, if you visit the Diego Rivera's museum, you will still see this drawing. It's huge there, but the painting was missing. Since 1950s, nobody saw this painting. So this is still a mystery. Where is this painting now? Is it destroyed, or is it somewhere else? Or I tried to find answer of this question for many years. I'm still working on that, but I haven't get a clue. But a lot of people saw the painting, mostly in Mexico City, and a close friend of Diego Rivera and his assistant all said that they knew the painting was sent to China. And also there are some Chinese artists say that they saw the painting in Beijing in 1950s, but we don't know where it's now, or someday we will find it, maybe in the future. So that was another Diego Rivera's painting was lost after Chinese showing in Beijing. But a few years ago, the painting was found in Moscow, in Pushkin Museum. This was the catalog of the show. And that was one of the paintings by Sigueras showing in China. This is the Chinese officials' visit opening of the show. The exchange continues with visits by Mexican artists like David Sigueras, Arturo Bustos, and a Chilean muralist, Jose Venturelli. Sigueras gave a lecture to the Chinese Artists Association in October 1956 and strongly criticized socialist realism. He advised Chinese artists not to follow the footsteps of their fellow Russian artists. In one of discussion, he said, not only new content is needed for art, but also new form. We need a new form that is differentiates from the art of any other time. This art has to observe all the great achievements created by artists prior to our time, including those of modern Western schools. So this kind of a view at that time in late 1950s was hardly to be heard in China because Western art was totally forbidden. But the Sigueras was the general secretary of a Mexican Communist Party. So Chinese leaders have to treat him well and let him speak. And his talk was published and distributed inside of a Chinese art community. Mexican artists' paintings and their ideas excited and inspired young Chinese artists, presenting alternatives to the Soviet style. Many students in art academies tried to use their new approach to paint despite the criticism they might face. Yuan Yunsheng, then a student at the Central Academy of Fine Arts, explained why he was attracted to Mexican art. He says, quote, because their political ideas and artistic pursuit were in complete consensus. They were not forced by others. Yuan was labeled right as a student because he didn't follow the mainstream. And he was sent to a labor camp because he made his graduate project in his own style. So this influence continues after the Cultural Revolution. The first art event that marked the beginning of the new era for Chinese arts after the Cultural Revolution was the Mural Movement. Commissioned by the Beijing airport in 1979, a group of Chinese artists complete a dozen large-scale mural paintings pushing the boundaries of artistic expression. With muralism as its vehicle, the dialect of contemporary art repaired the breaks with its past to push forward into a new and unique style now heralded around the world as contemporary Chinese art. So the mural, there's a Beijing Airport mural project even earlier than Xingxing Star Society. So many historians believe the Star Society was the first event of the Cultural Revolution for contemporary art. Actually, I think we should add this mural movement. Even they are not so conceptual, they still use a lot of traditional forms, but it was the breakthrough during that time. Mural technique continues to prevail as an important tool in the expression of today's Chinese artists. So I show you one of the image of by Liu Dahong. Liu Dahong is an artist from Hangzhou, then now he's working in Shanghai, teaching in art school. But this is a very large mural he did in 2000 years. And this exactly reflected that the influence we can see from Cultural Revolution, all the images, all the message, the icons, they are taken from Cultural Revolution. And the form, the size, and they come from Mexican murals, paintings. And Liu Dahong, we now consider one of the most important, very unique contemporary Chinese artists. And he, personally, he believed, actually, he said, I was educated totally in a different kind of, influenced by different art schools. And so I come to my own style when I need to take any things from other school, it was not hesitant to do so. So I have been working on an exhibition proposal that demonstrates this significant cultural interchange. Over the past few years, I have interviewed artists, visited important art sites in both China and Mexico, introduced Chinese muralists to Mexican muralists in Mexico City and Guadalajara and other cities, collected unique and valuable primary resource, and translate important primary document for dissemination among the scholars community in different countries. So this proposed exhibition will be a major international production joined by museums in Mexico, China, and North America. Now, actually, LACMA in Los Angeles, they are very interested in producing this exhibition. Next week, I will receive their curator. They will come to Vancouver to visit me. So I get very excited because this is one of my the part of my ongoing project I hope eventually can be realized. I think the significance of this exhibition is that succeeds in representing a modern Chinese art history through its own reality and the logic for the first time. I'm not saying to select and evaluate art by Western criteria in general is all wrong, but we need to examine art trends and the changes within its own context to better understand and define their relationship. It is necessary to note that an objective and comprehensive study of the development of contemporary art in China and the other Asian countries have never been fully conducted. I would like to quote American scholar Dr. Judy Andrews' words to conclude my presentation. She said, modernism, socialist realism, postmodernism, and the various forms of traditionalism coexist, competing and interacting in ways that may bear little relation to the history of Western art. China's artists will continue to construct their culture at the juncture of their own particular history and the trend of the contemporary world of which they are a part. Thank you.
Thank you, Zheng Shengtian. Yeah, it's wonderful. And I think that your talk really, underlines something that I've really believed, is that modernity and modernism in general is about the intersection and interference of influences between cultures. So at the same time that Chinese artists are going to Paris to study at the academy there, that Cubists are borrowing African masks, and European modern art is very much influenced by art from outside of European tradition, and this is really very well expressed in the Chinese case. I think we can have some questions.
I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about gender in the context of the artists that you have presented. I've noticed that most of them are men. Are there any female painters? Does gender feature in any way in your view of
You mean in contemporary Chinese?
Yeah, but I was also thinking, within the context of communism, the gender relation is, you're first and foremost a worker, and then you're a man, a woman, Chinese, or anything else, right? So I was wondering, did that help women artists to become visible and recognized, and do we still see their visibility today?
In the Chinese art community, or international art scene, actually, we saw a lot of Chinese, great Chinese female artists, like Vancouver Art Gallery showed very good work of Yishu, and 2 months ago I gave a talk at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. They showed the very good artists from Beijing. So there's like another artist just had a show in New York in the Asian Arts Society. So I think if you talk about contemporary art scene, I think female artists are a very important part of this picture. Equally important, sometimes even more. But in the history, it was true that less women artists in the different periods. This is owing to the general kind of the tradition of a Chinese family. I think less girls were sent to the school compared to boys. If the family only have limited resources, they would send their son to the school, not the girls. So in early time, like even after the communist established republic, still in the school you see a small part of female students compared to. I think there are great change because the government did encourage more girls to go to school, middle school, high school, college, and they give even some kind of a support by selecting. They give a school a kind of a special standard to choose. It means if the woman, the girl had the same score as the boy, you can choose the girls first. So that kind of policy adopted, I believe, in 1960 until like probably now. But it's still in the school, we we saw less girls than boys. I remember when I first come to the United States in 1980, early 1980s, I was teaching a class. And to my surprise, I saw like 40 students, and there are 35 girls, only 5 boys, which is exactly opposite when I was in China, because I taught in my school in Hangzhou. I have 16 students, then I have 1 girl, and all other boys. This, I think, in general, was the influence of the society, the structure, and but as a teacher, I found the female students as good as a male student, and I really believe some of the artists are now on the top of Chinese art scene.
We just saw the Zhu Bing show at Mass MoCA called Phoenix, but it had the 2 dragons in it. And I'm curious, like, he was a contemporary of Ai Weiwei in that, and I know that the piece was commissioned and then decommissioned. So I'm wondering where you see the trend right now in China in terms of art opposing the existing situations, and that's what he was doing in that piece, I think, in the message he was trying to present.
I didn't see the work you mentioned, unfortunately. I cannot really comment. But the shipping is very different with the other contemporary artists. I think many contemporary Chinese arts, we can see clearly where their influence come from, you know, either from pop art or from conceptual art or from other particular artists. But Xu is the one always emphasized that he wants to produce art for mass, for people. He even has his own slogan. So he was the one tried to actually combine what he learned from his young age, you know, he from the Cultural Revolution or after Cultural Revolution, that time when the school is still mainly dominated by the socialist kind of ideology. So he was not like other artists criticize that socialist ideology. Instead, he tried to implement a kind of introduce some into his work. Like one of his work I exhibited before was the work called Word from Ground. Is another project continue to his work from sky, Word from Sky. Word from Sky is he created there's a calligraphy, there's characters which is not readable, but there's a word from ground. He using all this the sign, the symbols from the public area, like stop or man or woman or restaurant. He used all these signs to create a language which everybody can read. That exactly is his idea of. He said that the art should work for people. I think that in his work, you see a more tradition in a way. He kind of interweave with his new concept of contemporary art.
How does Ai Weiwei fit in this whole thing, today's channel?
Ai Weiwei actually was one of the artists that he went to New York earlier, I think in 1980s. He spent 10 years in New York. So his influence, just like many of others, mainly from like Joseph Beuys, those Western artists. So in 1980 or early 1990s, he was among those groups. You can see his work not in some shows. People pay attention, but he didn't get special attention like what he got now. I think that was only happened when he went back to China. He decided to relocate to Beijing after his stay in New York. And he started to get involved in the social events in China. And so his work actually become more political in a way. Like his work I really like about this earthquake in Chengdu, Sichuan area. He made this hundreds of student bags, installed in the museum, which represent the kids was killed during the earthquake because of the really bad construction of the school buildings, and which Chinese government were not to kind of report it or announce. So since then, I think this made him more famous, especially outside of China, and I think when we talk about the influence, you can see his work not only from the Western contemporary art from Joseph Beuys, all those artists, but also from the Cultural Revolution, or even from the early the socialist realism. He did some paintings actually in late 1980s in the United States. I saw one of the small show. He was a very good painter, but now he doesn't paint. He's had very good training in paintings, and he could do as good as other artists. But that training, as many Chinese artists, I think that kind of academic training really built the basis for foundation for these artists. So when they want to create their work, they have very good sense of the artistic language. They know how to use it. They know how to control color, how to control the textures, or the material. Those I think they owned from their traditional training.
I'm not quite sure how to ask this question because of my ignorance. So excuse me, please. Your talk is very interesting, and I wondered how the early career of an artist like Wang Yongping and the kinds of things you're speaking about with these other artists, influences coming in from outside, how that could be discussed, because that was a very conceptual thing that was happening with Wang Yongping when he was very young. Did he have academic training before that? It seems like there may be two streams, or perhaps even more than two streams, going into contemporary Chinese art from influences that you're tracing back.
Actually, Wang Yongping was one of my students. He came to Hangzhou in 1977 to the academy where I was teaching. And actually, last month I was in Paris. I made an interview of him. I want to know what happened before that, because I knew what he was doing in Hangzhou when during that 4 years, he started to read. He reads a lot. Actually, he was not like other artists, spend all the time in the studio. He did very little painting, drawing, just finished assignments. But the most time he said he was reading. He tried to read everything he can get on hand. So he learned a lot about Western philosophy, modernism, and some other book. But before that, he was from Xiamen, in Fujian province, Amoy. His father was a business man. So their family was not very rich, but it's comfortable enough for him to start his art study by himself. He was able to find a local art teacher to teach him basic drawing and those kinds of things, maybe find some art book too. But only when he come to the academy, he was able to get in touch with the new idea. And also at that time, because our library just opened after the Cultural Revolution, so students were able to get all these books. So he became a very thoughtful scholar. I say scholar because he can write a long essays on some theory, which even teachers couldn't read. My wife, as Hank said, mentioned, she was actually 1 year was his teacher, and Huang Yunping always give a paper to my wife, but my wife admitted that he never understand. He was writing. But in the school, he was a good student. He obeyed the school rules, not like other students may become kind of a troublemaker or try to break all the requirements by the conservative faculty. So in the school, teacher saw him as a good student. But when he left, he graduated from Hangzhou. He moved back to his hometown. He became a free artist, Then it was that time he started to organize as a Shaman Dada, after like Dadaism, and have this anti-art event. That was the beginning of his work. So I would say he was his approach was began in the academy, from his learning, from his reading, and a lot of thinking. But only when he graduated, he had a chance to practice. So made that in reality. And I remember one of his early work in 1980s was a painting. At that time, one of the French museums sent a major exhibition of landscape, like a Barbizon style or landscape, and some realistic paintings in 19th century. So one of the painting was very popular. It's a woman sitting, like a peasant, a farmer, sitting in the field, and have a little like a lunch break. So that painting was very popular because it was a very skillful painting. So Huang Yunping, as a good painter, he copied this painting made a really good copy, like a replica of the painting. But then he changed a little bit about this woman's face. It's just like what Duchamp did for Mona Lisa, you know, but make this kind of attached to the traditional art. So that was the beginning of his rebellion style. But then gradually he became a more and more kind of avant-garde, and then I think at the end of the 1980s he was seen as the leader of this young avant-garde group.
One follow-up question?
Yes.
Did European curators travel in China to select work for the exhibition in France that was called Magicien de la Terre? Because he was in that show, and I believe it was that.
Magician, is it they call it the word magician in English?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Right. Yeah. It was the curator. What is his name? Yeah. Actually, I met him when he come. He was he come to China in late 1980s. He was taken by Chinese young scholar Fei Dawei. So they travel through China, different cities, come to Hangzhou, and I met Fei Dawei and they actually come to my house. We discussed it, and so after their visit, he chose four artists from China for that show, including Huang Yongping. So he was one of the early curators, because in 1980, they're very rarely seen a curator from outside, from European or North American museums. Only some dealers at that time had very good sense of the market that they come to China. So only, I think, from North America, the one curator who visited China around that time is Barbara London from MoMA. She visited China. She even made a website to introduce kind of his travel diary, introduce what she saw in China during that time. Only after 2000, I think more and more artists want to go to China. I remember I organized one tour for a dozen of curators, including Canadian curator Jessica Brandley. From at that time, she works for HO in Ottawa, and but most important curator in that group is Okui and Wizard, and he's a documentaire Lynn Cook from DIA, and Chris DeCon, now is the director of Denmark. So all these people, they visit China only from 2000. So it's from then on, you see more and more people.
And are these curators interested in artists like the ones that you're showing right now on the screen?
Yeah, they did. Actually, I took them visit Liu Dahong, and but most remember the story is about Yang Fudong, because Yang Fudong was very young at that time. Nobody knew about him. He graduated from Hangzhou Academy and worked in Shanghai. And we went to Dingyi studio, because at that time Chinese institutions still not allowed contemporary art. 2000, this is only like 13 years ago. But there was no museums showing contemporary art at that time. So we were not able to invite the artists to the museum to have their presentation. Instead, in Shanghai, we use the studio by Ding Yi because he just got this new apartment. You have to climb the 5th floor in China to go to the art studio. But anyway, so we were looking at artwork during the day. So after a long day, everybody exhausted, we are going to leave. And the Yang Fudong still sitting like a stair, didn't say anything. Then I said, Yang Fudong, did you bring anything because we are going to leave? And then he was kind of shy and he said, yes, I brought tape of my work. Then I said, hurry, put this in the monitor. So he put this in the monitor. Then once this film started, everyone come to the screen. Every curator come to the screen. And the work is so beautiful, It's attracted all the curators. So that evening, I get 3 artists come to my room, said, Shen, can you arrange a meeting with the Yang Fudong? And Okui said, I'd like to bring him to document, but in one condition, this work shouldn't be shown anywhere else before Casa. And if he agrees, we will pay all the costs to, finish this project and all the editing and all this. And also Christicom come to me. At that time, he was the curator for a museum in Holland. He said he liked to show Yang Fudong also he wanted. And then another one is, his name is in the Renaissance Society in Chicago. Suzanne, Suzanne Gaze. She also want to meet Yang Fudong. So from then on, Yang Fudong become very popular. In a few years, last year when we showed Yang Fudong in Vancouver Art Gallery, Dinah Gator said a very good interpretation. She said, how many artists can have the first show in Documenta, first international show in Documenta? That was him. So I think those curators are very important to China. Although there is also very strong criticism about this, because they say that this kind of a some Chinese artists that give some nickname to the curators, call them the colonists or doctors. If you come to choose patient or something like that. So it's not. I showed a picture of a young artist with Rauschenberg's work. Actually, there was an argument between young artists and Rauschenberg, so there was always a kind of a confrontation from Chinese artists' side facing the visitors from West. But of course, we can see this is a it's kind of a react when you feel you have to be chosen by outside curators, and then you will get a chance to show. You don't feel good, but you want this. Yeah. So that's exactly the work produced by Zhou Tiehai. It's about this kind of a confused feeling. You want it, but you hate it.
Okay, maybe one more. Yeah.
Okay, 2 things. Some of the Chinese artists that I've seen are in Western Europe and in the United States, very good Chinese female artists. So there you go. And number 2, famous work was, do you think on any account, inspired by Pearl Burke, the author?
By?
Pearl Black.
Pearl S.
Oh.
Yeah. American novelist.
The American novelist, the one who was the daughter of a missionary in China.
Yeah.
Do you think the work was
now I think the new generation, when I talk about the new generation, is the people after 1980s or even 1970s, very few artists knew about Pearl Beck. But of course, the older generation read her book and was not influenced, but I think her book on China in the time was a good introduction to the West, because she knew so much about China. There was even movies, from her book. But I remember the artist Covarrubias actually did some illustration for that book, or some kind of work from Beck's book. Yeah.
Was the artist that the lady was talking about, is it Feng? Like the one who read it out and was a scholar, the one your wife taught.
Oh, Wang Yongping.
Yeah. Would he have been influenced by her too?
I don't know. I never heard from him mentioned about it.
Thank you.
So thank you to the audience for very well informed questions, and thank you, Zheng Shengtian, really terrific talk. It's so interesting, now, Chinese contemporary art's on the front page, but it's very rare that we get the opportunity to hear the backstory and the foundation. So thank you so much.